En aquesta primera ponència es mostrarà la perspectiva que té la UNESCO sobre el tema del nostre congrés, Arxius, Identitat i Estat. I qui millor que fer-ho que el director dels arxius de la UNESCO, en Boel, que també és el coordinador del projecte d'història de la UNESCO i des de l'any passat és cap dels serveis d'informació d'aquesta mateixa institució. Boel és llicenciat en Història i Ciències Polítiques de la Universitat de Copenhague i ha treballat com a arxiver en l'Arxiu Regional de Copenhague i ha estat investigador del Museu i Arxiu Nacional de Groenlàndia fins a l'any 93, any que es trasllada a París a treballar com a arxiver a la UNESCO. I a partir de l'any 95 es converteix en el director d'aquests arxius. També ha tingut una presència destacada en el Consell Internacional d'Arxius, ha estat membre del Consell Executiu durant els períodes 2000-2004 i 2008-2012 i ha estat president de la secció d'organitzacions internacionals del mateix Consell Internacional d'Arxius. Ell ha publicat diversos llibres i nombrosos articles sobre la història del segle XIX i XX i sobre arxivística i ha participat d'una manera activa en els debats internacionals sobre el paper dels arxius dintre de la societat i la cooperació entre historiadors i arxivers. També té una faceta més mediàtica. Ha coproduït el programa de televisió sobre història colonial a Groenlàndia, ha coeditat les revistes d'història Christische Historikere i ha treballat com a corresponsal a París del setmanari danès Weekendavisen. Ell, en aquesta primera ponència, ens presentarà, des del punt de vista de la UNESCO, el tema d'arxius, identitats i estats, centrant-se en tres aspectes bàsics: la UNESCO i el paper dels arxius i les ciències històriques, la UNESCO i la idea, i desenvoluparà la idea d'arxius universals, i la participació de la UNESCO en els debats polítics sobre la restitució dels arxius. I ja està. Quan vulgui pot començar.
Bon dia. I'm sorry, I'm not going to speak in Catalan, which I should, of course, but I think the language of archivists is international, universal anyway, so I hope you'll understand me. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Juan, Patricia, the whole team, the whole organizing team. When I was invited for this Congress, one of my friends and colleagues at the International Council on Archives, Christine Martinez, said that this would be a great event. It's one of the best she knew of, and I really should go. And already now I sense that this is the case. It's really great being here. Thank you for the invitation. And also, I would like to say that the speech we heard just before the break, the intervention by Borja de Riquer, was, I found it very interesting, and I'll come back to it during my intervention here today. And then also, finally, I would like to say that I hope there will be a lively discussion. There will be time for questions and comments and discussion after Trudy and I have spoken, because after my intervention, then Trudy Petersen will speak, as you know, and then there will be questions afterwards. So what I'll like to do now is to speak about UNESCO's vision during the years, UNESCO's vision and work on archives and historical sciences. This is the first part, and then go into the development of the idea of universal archives. And third, UNESCO's involvement in policy discussions on restitution of archives, of displaced archives. And then in conclusion, I'll say a few words about the Memory of the World program, its vision of shared heritage, and how this relates to the topic of archives, identity, and state. And in addition to the text that you have already seen, or are seeing now maybe, I will say a little bit more about the Memory of the World program, just to show you some examples of the kind of documentary heritage that can be included in the register, and the reasons why they can't be included, what makes them universal, what makes them really significant for humanity as a whole. So maybe you recognize this gentleman. The judge, Balthasar Garzón, was present at the Brisbane ICA, the International Council on Archives, Congress here last year in August 2012. And I'm showing you this first because what Garzón has done has meant a lot to the topic we are talking about today, in my view, in any case, because he's a public figure who has largely contributed to demonstrate the role of records in holding those in power accountable. In particular, I'm thinking of the arrest of Pinochet in London in 1998. And this has contributed to putting archives and records at the heart of societies and of debates in societies. So the interplay between archives, identity, and state has been at the heart of UNESCO's mission and activities right since the organization was created. UNESCO's goal was defined in the preamble and the first article of its constitution, which was adopted in London in November 1945, just after the end of the Second World War. This mission statement, it rings like a utopia, a dream. Its quality swings from its idealistic and determined ambition to change the world in the wake of the horrendous crimes and tragedies before and during the Second World War. This should be done by working on the construction of the defenses of peace in the minds of men, based on the recognition that if peace is not to fail, it must be founded upon the intellectual and moral solidarity of mankind. This is a quote. All the concrete work, the areas of work of the new organizations were imagined and decided upon with this lofty ideal in mind. What later was to be called a culture of peace or a new humanism. Education, culture, communication, the sciences, these were defined as the fields of competence for UNESCO within the UN system. Activities related to archives had to do with all these areas, in particular with culture and communication. It is essential to stress that UNESCO worked on these activities and worked on archives, not just for technical reasons, but because they were considered absolutely necessary for the shared memory of humanity and for promoting international understanding. Preservation of and shared access to archives were seen as ways of supporting the organization's overall mission by contributing to building a universal consciousness of the oneness of humanity. One of the first major steps for UNESCO in this field was to find ways to develop and strengthen the international professional network of archivists and archives. With this objective in mind, the International Council on Archives, the ICA, was created at UNESCO by a group of experts, mostly directors of national archives, And this group met in June 1948, almost day by day, 65 years ago. The ICA was one of a number of professional non-governmental organizations created by UNESCO during the early years of its existence, with the idea of reaching out to civil society. Although UNESCO was an intergovernmental organization, it distinguished itself in the UN system by emphasizing its strong links with civil society. For example, it created, and this is just like its predecessor, the League of Nations International Institute for International Cooperation. It created national commissions composed of representatives of academic communities in practically all member states. Creating non-governmental organizations was another way of getting beyond the purely governmental means of action. So, what difference could the ICA make, and what was the philosophy behind setting up this new network? The very first constitution of the ICA, which you have here on the slide, it was adopted during the 1948 meeting in Paris. It declared that the role of this new international professional body was to preserve, protect, and defend the archival heritage of humankind and with the documentation of human experience for the benefit of mankind. The UNESCO perspective was expressed at the first Congress of the ICA in 1950 by UNESCO's Director General Jaime Torres Bodet from Mexico, who stressed that archives were the condition for the continuity of human experience and the possibility of good government. Archives should be perceived as the instructive traces of life, rather than immense cemeteries where the experiences, the adventures, the risks, and the dramas of society are buried forever. It is interesting to see so early on this clear awareness of the complex nature of archives, a tool for good governance through effective record keeping, a way of safeguarding memories of societies, and as the ultimate goal, the embodiment of a social responsibility and democratic necessity to provide access to evidence and information. In the field of archives, UNESCO's work was concentrated on several parallel tracks. Facilitating access was a driving force from the outset. Although records and archives were recognized as tools for governments underpinning decision-making, accountability, and administration, there was also a clear understanding of the value of giving wider access to archives for scholars, but increasingly also for the general public. Archival activities were, from UNESCO's perspective, closely related to the promotion of history, the historical sciences. I'll just move back, just a sec. Okay, just a sec. Oh yeah, sorry, I want to go back to this. The archival activities of UNESCO were closely associated with history. So in 1950, UNESCO launched a very ambitious project involving 1,000 experts from more than 60 countries on the editing of a history of mankind. It took 26 years to publish all 13 volumes. The goal was to enhance the idea that humanity has shared history. Rather than fostering national pride and communitarism, history should help advancing awareness of universality and promote international understanding. This work was very much in line with the critical reflections on prejudices and stereotypes that had also been launched by UNESCO with regard to history and geography textbooks. This is what's meant by the revision of textbooks here. Hopes were that hostile perceptions of the others could be replaced by a mutual international understanding, a deeper sense of belonging to the same human race. As shown by the Danish historian Poul Duedal in a paper presented to a UNESCO History Conference at King's College at Cambridge University in 2009, the ambition to achieve consensus and a certain kind of international uniformity proved a major obstacle for the other main objective of the project, namely to analyze global cultural diversity and its mutual influences. The Cold War made the editing particularly complicated. The culmination of these difficulties came when the Scientific Commission for the History of Mankind project received the final manuscript for Volume 6, covering the 20th century. Only a few days after the manuscript had been handed over to the Soviet scholars for comments, they returned a comprehensive critical review, a total of 500 pages of objections and a very detailed guideline for the rewriting of the entire manuscript. So it was not easy. The first volume was published in 1963 and well received by reviewers. Later on, the reviews became increasingly skeptical. Poul Duedal points out that the text often tended to follow the lowest common denominator, that is, a harmless, smooth, and harmonized history, but he nevertheless characterizes the project as an intellectual landmark. The process leading up to the publication was groundbreaking in its ambitious attempt to get beyond Eurocentrism. The process can well be seen as a starting point of the post-war trend towards writing global history. UNESCO's activities in the field of archives and history came to play very actively into support for decolonization processes. In particular, what some historians have called the decolonization of the mind. This was part of the thought when UNESCO followed up on the history of mankind with a revised and updated edition, History of Humanity, and with regional histories. In particular, the General History of Africa, which was launched in 1971 and published from 81 to 93. In synergy with UNESCO's and the ICA's work on archives, this 8 volumes publication played a significant, maybe even decisive role in giving back history to Africa, as reflected in papers presented at the International Conference on UNESCO and Decolonization, which was organized by the International Scientific Committee for the UNESCO History Project in Dakar in 2009. Already from the late 1950s, UNESCO supported, in cooperation with the ICA, newly independent states and emerging decolonization by publishing the Guide to the Sources of the History of Nations. And those volumes of the guides were published between 1958 and 1984. These publications contributed to nation building and to preparing independence of colonies by including systematic overviews of the sources to the history of new nations and newly independent states. The ICA was growing and worked very closely with UNESCO with regard to both planning and implementing program activities. Experts were sent to countries around the world where they helped building capacities up through the 1960s and 70s and 80s in particular through awareness, training, and by creating archival schools in newly independent countries like Senegal. In the 1970s, the Records and Archives Management program, the policy studies called RAMP, which you probably all know, these studies were launched. These documents, they addressed a wide area of professional matters, reaching from best practices for the construction of archival buildings in tropical areas, over legal issues to preservation, appraisal, and access topics in different contexts. Electronic records keeping, or machine-readable records, as it was called at the time, came on the agenda in the 1980s. The RAMP studies became reference texts for the archives and records management profession all over the world. They ceased to appear by the end of the 90s, but left a gap that still remains to be filled. One of the key topics of this Congress is identity, where from UNESCO perspective, identities are multiple, and what is particularly important is building the understanding of belonging to a universal community. In the field of archives, this is reflected in the concept of universal archives. And here we come back to the slide I had before. So there is an extremely interesting overview and discussion of the history of the concept of universal archives in an article by Emma Rothschild, who is a British historian who is now a professor at Harvard University in the US. This article is from 2008, published in the Journal of World History with the title, The Archives of Universal History. It is available if you do a Google, in fact. It's available, made available by Harvard University and the Journal of World History. So Emma Rothschild tracks back the pre-modern projects of a universal repository of archives. She tracks it back to the 7th century before Christ, before our time, to the collection of the Assyrian king Assurbanipal in Nineveh. A more recent and a very telling example is Napoleon's 1812 archive. Napoleon envisaged to create universal archives in France and brought collections from many of the temporarily defeated countries to Paris, from where they were returned after Napoleon, in his turn, was forced from power. This was a huge enterprise with thousands of archives cases brought to Paris from Vienna and Rome. From Spain, 500 carriages with the papers of the Royal Archives were sent to Paris from Simancas in Valladolid. For centuries, even millennia, the idea of universal archives was closely associated with centralized governmental power. By the end of the 19th century, universalist ideas emerged, ideas associated with utopian dreams of a humanity that would no longer be divided by nationalist stereotypes and prejudices. These ideas found concrete expressions, for example, in the universal photo archives of the philanthropist Albert Kahn in Paris, and in the attempt to create universal archival classification system by way of the Dewey or the Universal Decimal Classification, the UDC systems. As Jay Winter, an American historian, has pointed out, the UN itself was a small utopia, and this is just as true for UNESCO. The idea of a universal archive is enduring, as Emma Rothschild has demonstrated. It has accompanied UNESCO since the beginning. It is an illustration of the force of this ideal that the archivist of the United States, at the moment of the creation of the UN and UNESCO, he was also one of the founding fathers of the ICA, and his name was Solon Buck. He saw the international archival work as a matter of worldwide democracy. From this international perspective, archives touch upon the essence of democracy and human rights, accountability of governments, the citizens' right to know. So UNESCO's work on archives through the decades shows that the organization has always worked for the idea of universal archives in the sense that it has strived for universal preservation of and access to archives and tried to bridge the divide between the rich and poor countries and institutions. The endorsement, which was mentioned earlier today by UNESCO in 2011 of the ICA Universal Declaration on Archives, underpins this commitment. And then you could ask, but what does it mean that such a declaration has been issued and endorsed by UNESCO? Maybe it's just words. Maybe it doesn't really change anything. Well, to this I would just say that the power, the potential power of the Universal Declaration and UNESCO's endorsement is that archivists around the world and citizens, anybody around the world, can refer to this statement and can tell their member states, that tell their own governments that they actually voted for this at UNESCO. So they are committed to follow the principles. For instance, earlier this morning, when Borja de Riquer mentioned a number of cases where there are limits to, arbitrary limits to access to archives, so there is not really a state of law in that area and not a genuine free access to archives, then it is possible to refer to this declaration and to say, after all, you voted for this, so please respect the principles that you accepted in 2011. So this is a symbolic power, but still it can be used, and in some cases it has already proven effective. Among the practical actions that have been undertaken by UNESCO in the past, and now I'm moving back before the declaration, were very ambitious microfilming activities, in particular in Latin America. So from the 1990s, these efforts, really to create universal preservation and access, these efforts became increasingly focused on digital issues. In 2003, UNESCO adopted a charter on the preservation of digital heritage, and in September 2012, a global policy document, the Vancouver Declaration, was adopted at a UNESCO conference on the digital memory of the world. What is particularly interesting in this context is that some of the ideas from the 1940s on providing universal access to archives as a shared heritage of humanity now seem to become more realistic to put into practice in view of the new technological possibilities. What seemed to be a dream, a utopian dream in 1945, could to some extent become reality in, for example, 2025. I'll now move relatively shortly to disputed claims and restitution of archives, because this is also an essential topic of discussion in this area where UNESCO has been active. The questions of restitution of archives were, in fact, part of the discussions already when UNESCO was created. At the time, it was in a very specific sense, namely in relation to looting in wartime. So it was really related to the Second World War and rebuilding the world after the war. These questions, they came up together with other war-related cultural issues, such as the destruction of libraries. During the work of the organizations that preceded UNESCO, namely the Conference of Allied Ministers of Education that met in London from 1942 to 45, and then the Preparatory Commission of UNESCO that existed from 45 to 46 when UNESCO really started working. So although these war-related issues, they were complex, many of them were still quite straightforward compared to those that followed when the decolonization process started in earnest. Back to the 17th century, restitution of archives had been taken into account by the end of the war. But when the big wave of decolonization came to Africa around 1960, and that year alone, 17 new member states from Africa joined UNESCO. So during that period of decolonization, archival questions were, as a rule, not addressed, and they were not settled when the colonizing countries left. In some cases, they were taken up immediately by the newly independent states. This was the case for Algeria, for example, but no solution was found. During the last decades of the 20th century, UNESCO was very involved in studies and attempts to find solutions to questions on location, ownership, and control of archives relating to former colonies. The United Nations convened a conference in Austria in 1983, during which the issue of restitution of archives was discussed alongside questions on restitution of debt and property as part of succession of states. The way decisions were taken at this conference, and maybe even the whole process leading up to it, was, however, quite divisive. So the result, the Vienna Convention of 1983, it has never come into force because it was not ratified by a sufficient number of states. UNESCO always encouraged negotiations between concerned parties in cases of disputed archival claims. In particular, UNESCO recommended that in situations where new states were created, the matter of archives should always be taken up explicitly as a theme to be discussed and solved. This was also one of the conclusions of the latest major UNESCO study in this field, namely Leopold Auer's survey of disputed archival claims, which was published as a RAMP study in 1998. Auer's and UNESCO's viewpoint was that such disputes should be solved by bilateral negotiations rather than by imposing general legal instruments. The ICA edited just after the adoption of the Vienna the Vienna Convention, an advisory note as critical comment stressing that solutions to these problems had to be very concrete and very specific. All concerned series and sub-series of records should be listed and answers found to each particular situation. Yes, as a short side remark here, I'd like to add a personal note, because as a young archivist, I worked for the Greenland Home Rule Government, and I realized to what extent it was important, not only for the Inuits of Greenland, but also for the population of Denmark, the former colonizing power, to include the archives about the history of the Greenlanders, of Inuits, in the collective memory of both peoples. The Greenlandic experience is an interesting one because it's an example of a peaceful and quite successful solution to the issue of archives in a transitional process towards autonomy and increasing independence of a country previously under the rule of another government. Essentially, consensus between Danish and Greenlandic officials was achieved on the principle that all archives created by the colonial authorities in Greenland should remain in, or when relevant, be returned to Greenland, while archives created by the central authorities in Copenhagen would remain in Denmark. Simultaneously, microfilming projects were launched. This was in the 1980s. So these microfilm projects aimed at sharing access to such archival holdings where the originals would be preserved elsewhere. In today's world, of course, a digitization process would have been chosen. So today, UNESCO's work on archives in support of citizens' right to know their history and of good governance principles, accountability, transparency, open government. This work is to a very high and growing extent related to the Memory of the World program. From its inception in 1992, this program has grown in depth and scope, which was demonstrated by last year's conference in Vancouver on the digital memory of the world. With regard to the topic of this conference, Archives, Identity and State, I find the concept of shared heritage particularly interesting. Far from communitarism and nationalism that could arise from such very identity-oriented topics, ownerships of archives, shared heritage, and an approach consisting in encouraging joint applications for inclusion in the register of the memory of the world, they go in the opposite direction. They go in the direction of promoting the idea of shared humanity with the heritage we all have in common. This is also in line with the growing awareness that all history is interconnected and often also transnational. Right now, just less than a month ago, by the end of April this year, the Executive Board of UNESCO has adopted a new action plan for the memory of the world. This plan aims at strengthening the program, giving it a stronger legal status, and the overall goal is to build international understanding and awareness of universally shared documentary heritage. The actions foreseen emphasize education and research as key ingredients to achieve this goal, and suggest giving consideration to establishing a Memory of the World Knowledge Center within the UNESCO Library. In 2012, the Memory of the World Register included 245 manuscripts and archival collections. Among them are 2 inscriptions from Spain. Looking more closely at the place where this Congress takes place and at 20th century history, it seems obvious to me that there are many possibilities for proposing inscriptions in the registry which relate to Barcelona, Catalonia, and at the same time go well beyond the borders of this autonomous community of Spain. Barcelona and Catalonia have impacted not only policies, economics, and culture across the world, but they have also impacted minds and imaginations. George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia is one of the most influential books about the Spanish Civil War. It has changed ways of understanding the complexity of political change for many people around the world. And something similar can be said about other works, other literary works, such as Mercè Rodorèda's La Plaza del Diamant, the Diamond Square, which was translated into English at the time of the dose. Both these books, they are powerful examples of the symbolic importance of the Spanish Civil War and how events here in Catalonia interact with profound developments in other places. Exiled Republicans around the world, in UNESCO, for instance, the former rector of the University of Barcelona, who was also a minister in the Republican government of Catalonia during the Civil War, Juan Bosch Kempera, he came to work at UNESCO. He was a very important figure in creating the history project at UNESCO, and he only left when Franco's Spain was admitted by the end of 1952. So this is just one example. But many exiled Republicans around the world had significant impact on ways of thinking and imagining politics, inspired by their experience with the Spanish tragedy. Archival collections reflecting this transnational impact of the Spanish Civil War could well be proposed for the inclusion in the Memory of the World Register. This is, of course, just one example, which I personally find interesting, but there are countless other possibilities. I'd like to go through some slides briefly on the Memory of the World Register, because this is part of the Memory of the World program. There is this register, which, as I said, includes, at this point in time, 245 inscriptions, documentary heritage from countries all over the world. And very soon, in June, there is a meeting in 1 month from now, where other proposals are also, I think, some that interest you here in particular, will be discussed, and others will be included. I'm just giving, I would just like to briefly explain the 5 specific criteria that enable documentary heritage to be included in the register. The universal criterion is that, well, the general criterion is that there should be a universal significance, universal interest. More specifically, there are 5. One of them is location. Here, for instance, these examples, they relate to the torture center in Cambodia and Phnom Penh, the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum archives. And there's also another specific location in South Korea, in Gwangju, where a student rebellion was, or demonstration was violently suppressed in 1980, and now the government itself has proposed that this should become part of the Memory of the World, which was accepted. So, and the location here is a particularly important element. Then the people, it can also be individuals, like the gentleman here on the right, who doesn't really need any presentation, but maybe it's difficult to see, but it's, well, Nelson Mandela. And then we have also groups of people or mass movements like the Baltic State, the human chain for independence, for freedom in 1980. This is the people, the significance of people. And then we have the subject and scene, which could be the fall of the Berlin Wall, and thereby also somehow symbolic the end of the Cold War. And in Australia, the Mabo case, which relates to the activist whose name was Mabo, who fought for the rights of Aboriginal peoples, and in particular, this case was about land rights, where he actually won. They won the case. So those documents proved that the Aboriginals had right to land in Australia. So it was a groundbreaking case, and therefore the subject is of universal significance. And then the form and style. So we have the speech by Le Général de Gaulle, the 18th of June 1940, where he urged the French to continue the fight against the Nazis. And we also have the burst of solidarity, the 21 demands. So there can be specific forms and styles. And finally, we have the, this is a little bit more tricky sometimes because it's a bit more vague, but it's very important. It is about the significance for a community, social, spiritual, or community significance of a document or of an archive. And here we have the Declaration of Human Rights, of the Rights of Man and the Citizen from France. So, well, I'll conclude, I'll end by saying that with this picture from La Mancha, which for me is still a symbol of hope, maybe naively so, but I believe that all these fights merit to be fought, and there are also some victories along the road. So I think that knowledge of archives and the use of them possess the potential power to transform societies. They do so because archival evidence makes it possible to know about the past. Thereby, archives can serve as a basis for truth, justice, shared understanding, and reconciliation. The Memory of the World program can play its modest role in the continuum of UNESCO's work since its creation. For archivists all over the world, and this could be in Palestine, in Israel, in Greenland, or in Catalonia, the initial dreams of the founding fathers and mothers of UNESCO and the ICA, these dreams remain valid. Through an approach that combines vision and pragmatism, we can get closer to a world where archives are truly shared and seen as belonging to humanity as a whole. Thank you.